June 1944. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached, but victory in Normandy was far from certain. Beyond the beaches, Allied forces faced an invisible enemy. Not just German guns, but the land itself. Normandy's hedgerows, innocent in peacetime, monstrous in war, turned every field into a fortress. Each embankment hid machine guns, Panzerfausts, and snipers. American tanks built for open battle found themselves trapped in green cages. Their engines roared, their tracks spun, and then silence. German fire struck one after another, reducing columns of Shermans to smoking wrecks. The world's most powerful army was being stopped by farmland. Commanders issued orders. Engineers tested explosives. Nothing worked. The breakout stalled, and the Allied advance risked collapse. Every passing day gave the Germans more time to dig in, more time to counterattack. And then, against all odds, the breakthrough came not from a general, not from a scientist, but from a mechanic. A single sergeant, armed with a welder and a scrap of steel scavenged from a beach obstacle, built something no manual had ever described. A crude, jagged invention that could turn a farm tractor into a weapon of unstoppable momentum. It was not built in a laboratory, it was welded in the mud, tested under fire, perfected by necessity. And when it rolled forward, the hedgerows that had trapped thousands of men began to fall, one after another. This is the story of how a field-made modification, known later as the Kulin hedgerow cutter, broke Hitler's defenses in Normandy and changed the course of the European campaign. June 1944, Normandy, France. The beaches were taken, but the victory was far from complete. In the days after D-Day, the Allied invasion force found itself trapped inside a landscape that seemed almost designed to stop an army. Normandy's bocage countryside was beautiful and ancient, but to the tankers and infantrymen of the US First Army, it was a green maze of death. What had looked like farmland on reconnaissance maps turned out to be an interlocking web of earthen banks, deep ditches and hedgerows, so dense that even a man could barely squeeze through. Each field was a fortress. Each lane was an ambush waiting to happen. A typical hedgerow stood 6 to 12 feet high. Centuries of wind, rain, and cultivation had hardened the earthen mounds at their base until they were as solid as concrete. On top grew tangled brush, hawthorn, brambles, and roots as thick as a man's wrist. These were not garden hedges, but living walls. Every field was enclosed by them, creating a patchwork of thousands of small compartments. The only paths between were narrow, sunken lanes that twisted through the countryside, walled in on both sides by high banks. A tank could move only single file. When the M4 Sherman tried to cross one of these hedgerows, its flaws became painfully clear. The tank's design favored speed, not brute climbing power. Its front slope armor was thick enough to deflect small arms and light artillery, but the belly, just over an inch of steel, was dangerously thin. As a Sherman's tracks rode up the mound, its nose lifted and its underside tilted toward the enemy. German gunners, lying in wait behind the next hedge, had a perfect shot. The Germans understood the terrain better than anyone. For months they had been preparing firing lanes, overlapping kill zones and concealed positions along every approach. Anti-tank guns such as the 75mm PaK-40 were dug into the banks, camouflaged beneath branches. Machine gun crews occupied sunken corners, and Panzerfaust teams waited in the shadows until a Sherman was halfway over a hedge. The moment its hull rose and its gun pointed skyward, the Germans opened fire. The results were predictable, catastrophic. American infantry advanced behind the tanks, but the hedgerows offered them little protection. Visibility was almost zero. Communication broke down. Platoons lost contact in minutes. Each time a tank tried to crest a hedge, its machine guns could not depress low enough to cover the men on foot. The infantry were left to fight off ambushes with rifles and grenades, while the tanks blundered ahead blind. Even when a field was captured, the next one, just 10 yards beyond, had to be fought for all over again. Engineers were called forward to find solutions. Some units tried to blast gaps using satchel charges or TNT, but the explosions warned the enemy and drew artillery fire. Bulldozers from the engineer battalions attempted to push through the hedgerows, but their massive blades made them easy targets for German mortars. Tanks equipped with dozer attachments could open limited paths, but they moved slowly and could not keep up with advancing troops. Morale suffered as the weeks dragged on. In letters home, soldiers described the bocage as green hell. A sergeant in the 29th Infantry Division wrote that every field felt like a self-contained battlefield. The First Army's progress was reduced to a crawl, sometimes no more than a few hundred yards per day. Commanders grew frustrated. Air power, one of the Allies' greatest strengths, was nearly useless. Bombers could strike villages and roads, but not individual hedgerows. Even fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt could not help tanks trapped beneath thick canopy and smoke. General Omar Bradley and his staff knew that the longer the advance stalled, the more time the Germans had to reinforce. The plan had been to break out from the beaches quickly, link up with British and Canadian forces, and push east toward Paris. Instead, the US First Army was locked in a slugging match against terrain itself. By early July, the situation had reached a breaking point. Reports from frontline units painted a grim picture. Tanks immobilized in ditches, infantry pinned by crossfire, engineers exhausted. Some units began improvising field modifications in desperation. Crews welded spare track links, logs, or metal rods to their hulls, hoping to gain traction or act as crude rams. A few officers experimented with explosive-tipped poles to blast through hedges. None of it worked well. The frustration was summed up in a briefing by one divisional commander who wrote, "The enemy need not defend the hedgerows defend themselves." It was a bitter truth. Despite the Allies' overwhelming air superiority, numerical strength and industrial might, they had met an obstacle older and tougher than any machine, the Norman earth. Behind the lines, tank mechanics, welders, and ordnance crews began to discuss the problem in their own way. Not as strategists, but as craftsmen. They saw the battlefield not as maps and arrows, but as metal and soil. Somewhere among them was a man who would look at a wrecked German obstacle, see potential, and decide that the solution to breaking Hitler's defenses could be built with scrap steel and a welder's torch. By early July 1944, the frustration had reached breaking point. The Normandy campaign, initially expected to surge inland within days, had stalled. The enemy's hedgerow defenses, natural yet ingeniously fortified, had turned the landscape into a fortress. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. Tank platoons wiped out by unseen Panzerfausts, infantry pinned by machine gun nests hidden behind earthen walls, and supply convoys immobilized by sniper fire echoing across sunken lanes. In this chaos, an unlikely solution emerged not from headquarters or design bureaus, but from the field. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, a mechanic with the 2nd Armored Division, listened to the daily complaints of tank crews. The men of his unit, battle-hardened yet demoralized, spoke constantly about how the Shermans' front could not breach the hedgerows. "You hit one," a tanker reportedly said, "and the damn thing just climbs it. Then you're showing your belly to every jerry gun within a mile." Cullen took that statement to heart. He began experimenting with scrap metal, scavenged from the battlefield. Destroyed German obstacles, particularly the steel beams known as Czech hedgehogs, provided an unexpected resource. The hedgehogs, originally meant to stop landing craft on the beaches, were now plentiful along the hedgerows where Allied troops had dragged them aside after D-Day. Cullen, with a small team of mechanics, began welding sections of these beams into crude prongs that jutted out from the Sherman's lower front plate. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of climbing the hedgerow, the tank would slice into it, cutting a hole through which it could pass. The initial prototypes looked absurd. Jagged steel teeth welded in asymmetrical patterns, rusted and rough, gave the tank a monstrous appearance. Some officers dismissed the contraption outright, calling it a field joke, but others saw potential. Cullen's platoon commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry E. Gardner, ordered a demonstration near the small French village of La Haye-du-Puits. Under the overcast light of a July morning, a modified M4 Sherman rumbled forward, its new metal tusks glinting dully. When it struck the hedgerow, the tank didn't rise, it chewed. Earth and roots burst outward, as the machine pushed clean through, leaving a gaping hole. The onlookers, including skeptical engineers and field officers, were stunned. News spread rapidly up the chain of command. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, immediately saw the strategic implications. He ordered further trials, refining the design. The Rhino tank, as soldiers soon nicknamed it, was born. Cullen's simple innovation, what some later called the hedgerow cutter, became one of the most impactful field modifications of the entire Normandy campaign. Manufacture began almost immediately. Army workshops across the front line began welding variants of Cullen's invention onto every available Sherman. By late July, over 500 tanks had been fitted with the prong device. Some crews took the concept further, experimenting with reinforced welds, different angles of penetration, and even using German armor fragments to strengthen the mountings. The effect on battlefield mobility was immediate and dramatic. Before the modification, Sherman units had been forced to funnel through narrow breaches created by engineers, predictable routes that became perfect ambush points for German defenders. With the hedgerow cutter, tanks could now make their own paths, appearing suddenly in unexpected positions. German anti-tank crews found themselves disoriented, unable to anticipate the next Allied move. Cullen's invention did not just change tactics, it reshaped morale. For the first time in weeks, American tankers felt they had a fighting chance against the terrain itself. Infantry commanders began coordinating new assault plans that leveraged the Rhino's ability to carve fresh entry points. Combined arms coordination improved. The once fragmented and slow advances began to gain pace. Yet despite its success, the bocage breaker remained a rough, improvised weapon. Many welds broke after repeated use. The prong sometimes bent on impact, requiring frequent field repairs. But even in its imperfect state, the tool was revolutionary. It demonstrated the adaptability of front-line soldiers, the willingness to innovate under fire rather than wait for orders from above. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the front and witnessed a Rhino in action, he was reportedly impressed. He ordered widespread replication of the device, noting it as one of the most ingenious field adaptations of the war. By the time Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, was launched in late July, Rhino-equipped Shermans were leading the charge. Their tusked silhouettes became symbols of Allied ingenuity, tearing through the hedgerows that had stalled them for nearly 2 months. The irony was not lost on many. While the Germans had spent years perfecting their armored doctrines, the Americans had turned battlefield improvisation into strategic advantage. What began as a mechanics brainstorm had evolved into a decisive instrument of victory. The men of the 2nd Armored Division, once trapped behind natural walls, now drove through them as if they were paper. As tank columns advanced deeper into Normandy, the Germans began to notice the change. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed growing confusion among enemy units. They described strange armored vehicles that appeared from unexpected directions, bypassing strong points entirely. The Atlantic Wall, so formidable on paper, was beginning to crumble, not from superior numbers alone, but from the cunning of a sergeant with a welder's torch. By late July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy, once an unyielding labyrinth, had begun to surrender. The American command had spent weeks preparing for a massive breakout operation, codenamed Operation Cobra, designed to shatter the German defensive line south of St. Lo. Unlike the grinding attrition of the earlier weeks, Cobra would rely on speed, coordination, and shock. The key to that speed lay in the newfound ability of Allied tanks to move through the bocage without pause. The invention of the Rhino had come at precisely the right moment. The landscape around St. Lo was scarred beyond recognition. Trees were splintered stumps, villages reduced to ash, and the air reeked of cordite and damp earth. American infantry had fought house to house for weeks to reach jumping-off points for Cobra. But now, with the Rhino tanks leading the way, the mood shifted from grim endurance to calculated aggression. On the morning of July 25, 1944, the sky above the front filled with the deep rumble of engines. Nearly 3,000 Allied bombers, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives on German positions along a narrow sector west of St. Lo. The bombardment, intended to soften the defenses, created a wall of smoke and dust so thick that visibility dropped to mere yards. As the air cleared, the ground assault began. Rhino-equipped M4 Shermans of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions advanced in columns. The prongs at their fronts gleamed with a coat of dried mud and welded steel, cutting into hedgerows like plows through wet clay. Infantrymen followed close behind, using the tank's flanks for cover as they moved through terrain once thought impassable. The hedgerows that had defined Normandy's defensive geometry now worked against the Germans. They had built strong points to channel the enemy into predictable routes. Now the enemy could come from anywhere. In the first hours of Cobra, resistance was fierce. German units, including elements of the Panzer Lehr Division and the 7th Army, fought desperately to maintain coherence. Many of their tanks, such as the formidable Panther and the workhorse Panzer IV, were constrained by the very hedgerows they once used to their advantage. Their long guns could not traverse quickly enough in the confined lanes. American Shermans, meanwhile, burst through the flanks, striking from angles no German had anticipated. A war correspondent embedded with the 183rd Armored Battalion described it vividly. It was as though the tanks had grown teeth. They chewed their way through France itself. Every hedgerow that had trapped men for weeks was now split wide. And through it came these steel beasts that refused to stop. By the end of the first day, Cobra's spearhead had advanced several miles beyond its start line, an unprecedented gain after nearly 2 months of stagnation. The German front began to buckle under the pressure. Commanders struggled to realign their forces, but the chaos of air bombardment, broken communications, and the sudden Allied mobility made it impossible. At the operational level, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley recognized that the Rhinos were not merely tactical tools. They had strategic value. He ordered their use in concentrated armored thrusts, using the Sherman's newfound ability to maneuver unpredictably as a weapon in itself. For once, the Allies dictated the rhythm of battle. The field innovation had also altered the psychology of combat. Tank crews who had once cursed the terrain now felt a renewed confidence. Reports from frontline officers noted that morale was at its highest since the landings. Infantry units moved with greater coordination, emboldened by the knowledge that tanks could follow wherever they went. The hedgerow hell had transformed into a battlefield of opportunity. As Cobra progressed, the German defense crumbled further. The Panzer Lehr Division, once among the most elite in the Wehrmacht, was reduced to fragments. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later admitted that Allied mobility had outpaced their ability to react. "The Americans appeared where we least expected them," he said after the war. "They came through the hedges as though the earth itself had betrayed us." By July 29th, American forces had broken free into open country. The armored columns, now unrestrained by hedgerows, accelerated toward Coutances and Avranches. The breakout was complete. Tanks roared across the French countryside, bypassing shattered German defenses. What had begun as a cautious crawl through constricted lanes evolved into a sweeping advance toward Brittany and the Seine. Behind the success, however, lay the simple genius of Coulin's idea, a handful of welded prongs that turned the tide of a campaign. The bocage breaker had proven more valuable than many factory-engineered solutions, a triumph of necessity and fieldcraft. It symbolized not only innovation under fire, but also the adaptability that defined Allied warfare in Europe. As the news of Cobra's success reached headquarters, Eisenhower himself noted the field improvisation in dispatches. He called it an example of American ingenuity meeting battlefield necessity. For the men who had once stared helplessly at the unbroken walls of the Norman countryside, it was vindication. The Germans, retreating in disarray, began to fall back toward the Seine. The once unconquerable hedgerows lay flattened behind them, mute evidence of how the balance of initiative had shifted. Normandy's terrain had been one of Hitler's greatest assets. Now it had been weaponized against him. By early August 1944, the tide in Normandy had turned irrevocably. The German Seventh Army was in full retreat, reeling from the combined effects of air bombardment, exhausted manpower, and the unexpected mobility of Allied armored forces. The hedgerow hell that had once protected them was now an open graveyard of twisted steel and smoldering wrecks. The American breakout during Operation Cobra had created a widening gap in the German line, one that the Allies were determined to exploit before the enemy could regroup. The key objective became the Falaise Pocket, a roughly 20-mile-wide corridor near the towns of Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois. The plan was to encircle the retreating German forces, an estimated 200,000 men, and annihilate them before they could escape east, toward the Seine River. British and Canadian troops advanced from the north, while the Americans and Free French forces pushed from the south. The jaws of the trap began to close. At the tactical level, the Rhino tanks continued to play a crucial role. Although the bocage was thinning as the terrain opened up, remnants of hedgerow country still dotted the route toward Falaise. The tanks' ability to plow through small embankments and field barriers without slowing kept the Allied tempo relentless. German rearguards attempted to establish defensive lines using anti-tank guns and hastily dug trenches, but these proved ineffective. The Shermans, now maneuvering freely, struck from unpredictable directions, cutting off pockets of resistance before they could solidify. The German situation deteriorated by the hour. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel after he was wounded in an air attack, faced an impossible command structure. Hitler's insistence on holding ground, his no-retreat order, meant thousands of German soldiers were trapped by geography and Allied firepower. Panzer divisions that once symbolized the might of the Third Reich were reduced to scattered platoons operating without fuel, ammunition, or coordination. Air superiority added to the catastrophe. American P-47, Thunderbolts and British Typhoons patrolled the skies, strafing convoys and destroying any vehicle that dared to move by daylight. Columns of German trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons burned along the narrow roads, turning them into corridors of fire. Survivors who fled into the fields found little refuge. The hedgerows that once provided cover now served as obstacles in their desperate flight. Inside the shrinking pocket, the chaos was absolute. Reports from German officers described the countryside as a slaughter pen. Units were cut off from radio communication. Artillery batteries fired blindly until they were overrun. Ammunition dumps exploded as Allied shells found their mark. The few functioning tanks that remained, mostly Panthers and Tigers, were forced to fight in isolation, unable to coordinate in the fragmented terrain. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed forward with calculated aggression. General George S. Patton's Third Army, unleashed after the breakout, drove eastward with astonishing speed. His armored divisions bypassed strongpoints, leaving them to be mopped up by following infantry. Patton's tanks crossed rivers, tore through villages, and linked up with British forces near Falaise. The once cautious Allied advance now resembled a pursuit. In villages like Mortain and Trun, American and Canadian forces captured thousands of German soldiers who had abandoned their vehicles and weapons. The roads were littered with destroyed equipment, half-tracks overturned in ditches, panzer turrets blown apart, and horses lying beside shattered wagons. The air stank of oil, smoke, and decay. By August 20th, the trap was nearly shut. A few remnants of the German Seventh Army managed to escape through a narrow gap near Chambois. But the cost was catastrophic. Approximately 50,000 German troops were killed or captured. Thousands more lay buried beneath the wreckage of their own machines. The Falaise Pocket became one of the most devastating encirclements on the Western Front. For the Allies, the outcome was decisive. The road to Paris lay open. The Germans had lost the bulk of their armored divisions in France, along with irreplaceable manpower and logistics. Within days, Allied columns were racing across open countryside, no longer constrained by hedgerows or static defenses, and through it all, the improvised Rhino continued to symbolize the transition from paralysis to momentum. It had begun as a desperate field modification on the beaches of Normandy. Now it was part of the arsenal that broke Hitler's grip on Western Europe. Engineers and soldiers across multiple divisions had refined its design, some using reinforced steel, others adapting it for bulldozers or half-tracks. What began as a local fix had become a standard feature in the US Army's mechanized toolkit. When Allied troops finally entered Paris on August 25th, the liberation of France was not merely a triumph of strategy or numbers, it was also a testament to adaptation. The men who had once struggled to cross a single hedgerow now rolled into the capital as conquerors. In after-action reports, senior officers repeatedly noted that without the Rhino device, Operation Cobra and the subsequent breakout might have been delayed by weeks, if not months. The Germans had built their defense on the assumption that the terrain itself would fight for them. They had never imagined that the Allies would literally reshape it. When the dust of Normandy settled and the last hedgerow battles faded into memory, the legacy of one small invention stood out as a symbol of Allied adaptability. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen's Rhino tank modification had not been born in a laboratory, nor approved by an ordnance board, nor manufactured in a factory. It was welded together in a hedgerow field with salvaged steel, a welder's torch and necessity. Yet its impact rippled through the remainder of the war, and far beyond it. After Operation Cobra and the Falaise encirclement, the United States Army Ordnance Department formally recognized the effectiveness of the hedgerow cutter. Reports from frontline commanders credited the device with transforming the tempo of ground operations in northern France. Engineers from the First Army replicated Cullen's design, manufacturing thousands of kits using scrap from destroyed German obstacles, especially the iron Czech hedgehogs that had once guarded the Atlantic Wall. By mid-August 1944, over 60% of the Shermans in service across Normandy carried some version of the Rhino device. The adoption was rapid and decentralized, a rare phenomenon in military logistics. Normally, modifications required testing and approval cycles, but in Normandy, battlefield necessity trumped bureaucracy. Soldiers welded, tested, and adapted on the move. No two cutters were exactly alike, yet all performed the same essential task. Breaking through barriers that had stopped an entire army, the design itself was deceptively simple. 4 to 6 sharpened steel prongs were welded at an angle to a reinforced frame, attached to the lower glacis plate of the Sherman's hull. The cutting teeth dug into the base of the hedgerow, splitting it from below rather than climbing over it. This preserved the tank's stability and kept its gun level, allowing it to fire immediately upon breaching a new field. In mechanical terms, the Rhino turned the tank into a hybrid between a plow and a battering ram. What made the invention remarkable was how it redefined tactical thinking. The US Army's doctrine had emphasized mobility and firepower, but had underestimated terrain as a variable. The Bocage proved that even advanced machinery could be rendered ineffective by geography. Cullen's design reintroduced mechanical adaptability into the equation, an idea that would influence post-war engineering philosophy.